Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a revisionist Western showdown when I put Arthur Penn's Little Big Man against Jim Jarmusch's Dead Man. And this one was an interesting one to get through, so let's just dive right on into the nitty and the picky. First up, we have Arthur Penn's Little Big Man, which stars Dustin Hoffman, who was, basically at the apex of his career stardom and stuff at coming off of The Graduate and Midnight Cowboy. And here he's playing the titular character, Little Big Man, who, the film opens with him as an extremely old man, like 121 or 2, really fucking old, and it kind of looking like even before Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but looking like the grandpa from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and William Hickey plays a historian who's interviewing him. He wants to know the lifestyles of the Native American Indian, but the Jack Crab, as the character's other name is, he's like, well, I know it all, and so he's going to turn that recorder on, and so basically this old man is recounting all the shit that he went through in life, starting from when he was 10 years old, when his family and their pioneer or settler group gets completely wiped out by Indians. And it's just him and his sister are the only ones that survive. And so then they're taken in by Indians, and the sister gets away, but Jack stays on, and he ends up, getting taken under the wing of Chief Dan George, who, it was one of two main Native American actors that were usually in westerns that had to deal with Indians, and it was either Chief Dan George or Will Sampson. And here it's Chief Dan George, and definitely not Chief Dan George's best performance. That might be the Outlaw Josie Wales or Americathon, but here he's kind of, his stuff is kind of silly. A lot of the stuff dealing with the Indians is very silly, but in a way tries to be, a little more respectful than most of the cowboys and Indians films that had been in westerns and stuff. Because at this point in time, in 1970, the audiences and the filmmakers had westerns just crammed down their throats so much that they were eager to just tear it all apart and tear it down. This is really that revisionist period of westerns that for lack of a better statement, killed the western. I mean, the western never went away. You just didn't. It wasn't as oversaturated by the time you get to the end of the 70s, because they spent the whole first half of that decade tearing them down. And of course, somebody like Arthur Penn, who was like a faux French New Wave filmmaker, and he had already tackled a legend, deconstructing a legend with the left-handed gun, tackling the legend of Billy the Kid. And here, this one's even sillier, because of course, through Jack's life, he sees, not only life with Native American Indians, but then, he ends up getting in league with a snake oil salesman played by Martin Balsam, who's, just way over the fucking top. Might be the most animated Martin Balsam performance I've ever seen. And then he gets sold to like a religious dude, real highly religious dude who's got a fucking sex pot for a wife, played by Faye Dunaway. And, best bath he ever had. I mean, shit, who wouldn't like to get a sponge bath from Faye Dunaway? And then, but then gets out of that. Then he becomes a gunslinger for a brief spell with the help of his sister, teaching him how to shoot. And then, he ends up getting drunk with Wild Bill Hickok, and who's played by Jeff Corey in a very animated way, and that's probably the most interesting part of the film, but they don't even really do that justice, because, how like alcoholic these gunslingers were, and just how almost pathetic, that life was. And even though it had been idolized in, millions of westerns. And then, of course, the biggest one, he runs into George Armstrong Custer several times, played just fucking animatedly by Richard Mulligan. And, I don't, Custer could have been, a fucking prick like that, but it just seems so over the top. And what, Arthur Penn's trying to do, he's trying to like break down all those fucking tropes of the Western, and, especially that massacre at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and just seeing Custer all like fucking silly and shit, and like, it's just one of those things where it's like I get what he's trying to do, but other than Bonnie and Clyde, he doesn't really have the power as a filmmaker to really make the statement that he's trying to make. And, but a director that does is Jim Jarmusch with Dead Man. Here is kind of the same thing, a revisionist Western that deals a lot with, you know, white the white man and Native Americans interacting with each other. Here we have Johnny Depp as sort of the titular character. Basically the whole film is kind of a death trip. Because he goes to this town called Machine by train, and he is got supposed to be an accountant for the Dickinson Metal Works and all this stuff, which is owned by Robert Mitchum, who is for as brief as he is in this movie, he definitely leaves a lasting impression. Of course, Robert Mitchum was a huge staple in westerns and stuff. And so after he doesn't get that job, basically gets laughed out of the office by John Hurt, who's absolutely brilliant in the film as he was in most shit. And so after he's trying to drink his sorrows away, he ends up meeting this lovely woman, and then she ends up getting shot by her scorned lover, played by Gabriel Byrne, and he shoots her, and the bullet goes through her and into Johnny Depp. And so now he's clinging on to this Native American gentleman, played brilliantly by Gary Farmer. I mean, that dude steals the show every time that he's in the frame. And he's basically guiding him. He's sort of a spirit guide, if you will, through his death trip. And the film itself was shot entirely in black and white by the brilliant Robbie Mueller. Anytime Robbie Mueller shot a Jim Jarmusch film, it was nothing short of brilliant. The film has the look of a nightmare, almost like a German expressionist film. The way they use smoke and that musical score by Neil Young is just fucking incredible, like just haunting and electric and just really just pulse pounding. And on this death trip, they encounter several colorful characters. Of course, there's a brilliant sequence with like these fur trappers played by Billy Bob Thornton, Iggy Pop, and Jared Harris. And that is just that whole exchange with them is just, that's pure Jarmusch. Like, this is the apex Jarmusch, where he just, he has, most of his films can be described as quirky but also very original too. And this is nothing short of that. Even the bounty hunters, or not hired guns, I guess, more like is the better description, that Robert Mitchum's character hires to catch Johnny Depp, whose name is William Blake, same as the poet, and which is something that nobody, the Native American gentleman that helps him along, takes, because he loves William Blake, is big fan of that. But the hired killers that are sent after Johnny Depp's character are fucking insane too, because you got Lance Henriksen, who was one of the greatest character actors of all time. Like, he just fucking is so sinister and doesn't say shit. And then you got Michael Wincott, who was just fucking always great as a villain type, anti-hero, or not even an anti-hero, just a sleazy, bottom-feeding motherfucker, but great fucking voice too, And Eugene Bird also plays the third one that's hired to kill, but he can't even really like stand with those guys. Like, they're so fucking batshit crazy. One doesn't talk, the other one doesn't shut the fuck up. And then also Alfred Molina has a really great scene as a trading post owner who's very prejudiced against Indians, and that whole scene. So the film is just like, it's the kind of film that like Sam Peckinpah probably would have loved. And it ends up getting in that little canoe and just going on his death trip, or going back to the spirit land and stuff. And like I said, the film is just one living nightmare, but also what Jim Jarmusch does and where he succeeds, where Arthur Penn failed with Little Big Man, is the fact that he is able to show the realities, the harshness, the horrors of the American West, as well as like poking fun at tropes and tearing shit down, but also making a real ass movie, a serious one that also has comedy and a lot of quirks to it. But the balance is there. With Little Big Man, you don't really get that balance. You know, it's all over the place. You get the sense that Little Big Man doesn't even know what kind of fucking movie it wants to be, but Dead Man knows exactly what it wants to be. So this round clearly goes to Dead Man because it is just a way better movie. Jim Jarmusch is a way better director than Arthur Penn, and the acting is better in Dead Man. Like everything about Dead Man just fucking smokes Little Big Man. I don't really think even that massacre scene, you know, it's meant to be shocking, but it doesn't even have the power that Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde did, you know. So pretty much he peaked with Bonnie and Clyde and never made a better movie than that. So for anybody keeping score, it's 68 to 55. 70s are only up by 13. Them 90s are coming back. That's two in a row that they've gotten now. So like who knows, man, this shit's getting wild, you know. That lead is still pretty big, so the 90s can still come back. You know, the 90s can still take the 70s, but right now they're still getting smoked to a certain extent. But they're holding their own, you know, they're throwing a few jabs here and there. So if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. Like I said, I don't give a fuck. This is all open for debate. Any film professors that want to use this shit, this revolutionary shit, man, but you gotta give me some money, you know. So, and if you got any suggestions, feel free to let me know. I got like 6 pages of these. Who knows how long I'll be doing this shit. You know, you'll be seeing them as many times as I'm able to do them. So, you know, shout out to Jim Jarmusch, one of the greatest of the indie directors to come out of the late 80s, early, or the, well, there's the 80s in general. So, and all the way through the 90s. You know, this might be his best movie. Arthur Penn, one of the most mid directors to ever like even grace the new Hollywood. So this is the 70s versus the 90s. I hope y'all enjoy it.